Between 1852 and 1865, a Catholic-run orphanage in Savannah quietly transferred dozens of children under its care. 15 of them were never officially accounted for again. No graves, no records, no inquiries. What remained was an unmarked ledger and a growing silence among those who worked closest to the institution's clerical leadership. In a city defined by strict hierarchies, few questioned what was happening inside its church-owned properties. This is the documented unraveling of one of Georgia's most concealed institutional disappearances. The St. Atalasia Parish Home for Orphaned Youth opened in 1849 under the patronage of local clergy and civic leaders. It was known for its tidy grounds, regimented routines, and near-complete secrecy. Publicly, the orphanage was a symbol of discipline and divine charity, lauded by newspaper editorials and supported by prominent benefactors. Staff were drawn almost exclusively from religious orders, and inquiries from outside agencies were routinely declined. Parents rarely reclaimed children, and few from the institution ever spoke publicly after leaving. For 3 years beginning in 1859, 15 minors were reported as relocated, but no trace of those relocations exists in any surviving diocesan or municipal archive. The property on Millen Street, facing east toward the Savannah River, was considered modest by diocesan standards. Red brick walls not fully aligned with the city's grander Gothic constructions enclosed the main dormitory and adjoining buildings. Despite this, St. Atalasia Parish Home for Orphaned Youth was respected for its administrative order and consistent output of trained apprentices. The children were reportedly transferred into work placements with merchants, stevedores, or rural landowners. Savannah's elite considered it a model of ecclesiastical responsibility. Father Matheson Crail served as the first director of the institution, beginning his term in 1851. He was not local, having arrived from an inland seminary in Augusta. Little is known of his early clerical life, but he had the bishop's trust and access to funds directed toward post-war reconstruction. His sermons emphasized discipline and productivity, rarely addressing the children directly. From preserved correspondence between Crail and the diocesan treasurer, a theme emerges: reduced dependency, increased turnover. Upon entry, every child was issued a number rather than being called by surname. This numerical system was explained as a practical solution to the common problem of duplicated names. In practice, it served as a means of record-keeping that detached individuals from familial association. Room assignments, meal portions, and behavior evaluations were all tied to these assigned digits. Paperwork was kept in a locked office behind the chapel. Access was limited to 3 individuals: Crail, the matron sister Pelagia, and a clerical assistant. Twice a year, the grounds were open to approved visitors. Donors, clergy, and municipal figures were given guided tours that avoided the dormitory areas. Emphasis was placed on the laundry quarters and classroom wing, both of which appeared orderly and well-staffed. Children were coached to recite passages, often from approved manuals, before being escorted out of sight. No questions about former residents were permitted. Official explanations for their absence varied: placement, relocation, or return to kin. Most of the staff were not from Savannah. Sisters and lay brothers came through a rotational system managed by the Diocesan Personnel Board. Assignments lasted 6 to 9 months on average. By 1860, few of the original staff remained. New arrivals were often briefed only on procedural matters, without any context for ongoing placements or file histories. One assistant, a brother named Costa, later noted in a private letter that when he asked about missing file pages, he was told that older entries had been consolidated. The children were given little education beyond religious instruction and basic trade training. Literacy was minimal, and arithmetic lessons were structured around agricultural ledgers or warehouse inventories. Interaction between age groups was limited. Older children were encouraged to apply for external apprenticeships beginning at age 11. Records of these placements exist only in ledger summaries, most of which ceased detail after 1862. The names of those who left were often struck out, with no notes indicating destination or employer. In 1859, an internal report was drafted for the diocesan board. This document, known as the Crail Memorandum, outlined plans for reducing overcrowding and increasing institutional output. The report recommended a new quota system for placements, aiming for a turnover rate of 70% within each 24-month period. Though not formally adopted, the recommendations were implemented immediately. Between the summers of 1859 and 1862, 27 children were removed from records under the category External Transition. Only 12 were later confirmed by name in parish employment rosters. The Savannah Municipal Council maintained no legal jurisdiction over orphanage placements. At the time, private religious institutions operated autonomously, unless accused of fiscal misconduct. Since the orphanage was donor-funded and maintained a positive balance, no such inquiry occurred. Regular visits from diocesan auditors focused only on expenses. Inventory logs from the period show consistent orders of candles, linens, and preserved goods, with few items designated for external shipment. Despite this, the number of resident children steadily decreased. In 1861, with the onset of the national conflict, resources across the region were strained. Yet St. Atalasia reported no significant disruption. Delivery routes continued, and staff rosters showed no major absences. This uninterrupted function raised questions among nearby institutions that had struggled to maintain operations. When the Sisters of Stillwater Hospital inquired about supply sharing, their letters received no response. A later diocesan circular would clarify that St. Atalasia operated under a specialized logistics agreement. Former residents rarely returned to visit. According to a later oral account recorded in the 1880s by an archivist named Milton Deeks, some ex-residents had relocated as far as Ohio or Alabama. None of those interviewed could identify individuals from the 1859 to 1862 cohort. One stated he had seen several leave the grounds at night, without luggage, accompanied by staff he did not recognize. This statement, while unverified, appeared in Deeks's unpublished notes filed at the Savannah Historical Records Office. No graves associated with the orphanage were ever registered with the city. While some institutions had designated burial areas or affiliations with nearby cemeteries, St. Atalasia maintained no such arrangements. A plot of unused land at the edge of the property remained vacant until 1874, when it was sold to a private developer. No documentation exists detailing what, if anything, was stored or constructed there during the intervening years. Soil surveys performed decades later show no irregularity, though excavation was never conducted. Administratively, the orphanage kept close contact with diocesan leadership, but rarely interfaced with secular authorities. This insulated structure made it difficult for external observers to detect inconsistencies. When a city clerk requested a census of religious institutions in 1863, St. Atalasia submitted its report 2 months late, omitting the number of current residents. No penalties were issued. A footnote in the clerk's ledger marked the entry as non-standard but accepted. By 1865, the institutional leadership changed. Crail was reassigned to a seminary post in Charleston. Sister Pelagia, now elderly, was transferred to a convalescent home. Her replacement, Sister Henriette, began a full reorganization of the orphanage records. Many of the older ledgers were either discarded or rewritten in updated formats. Discrepancies were noted but not flagged. According to correspondence between Henriette and diocesan administrators, there was insufficient continuity to confirm earlier transfer entries. An anonymous note, now housed in the diocesan archive and dated March 1866, references those years when numbers vanished without sound. The letter, unsigned, includes a list of dates but no names. While the handwriting matches other entries from a former staff member, the identity remains unknown. The letter was never officially investigated, and no reference to it appears in diocesan meeting minutes. It was filed under miscellaneous communications and was discovered only in the 1940s during a cataloging effort. The institution remained operational until 1889, after which it was converted into a seminary annex. The original buildings were renovated, and many internal documents from the earlier period were deemed obsolete and removed. Photographs taken during the transition show empty dormitories, discarded uniforms, and cleared storage areas. No sign of former residence or personal items is visible. In interviews with workers who assisted in the renovation, none recalled discovering records or belongings from the 1859 to 1862 period. The architectural layout of St. Athanasia remained consistent throughout its 3 decades of operation. Floor plans stored in the diocesan archive show no major expansions or demolitions between 1852 and 1889. The main dormitory wing held 6 rooms per floor, with each room containing up to 10 beds. One infirmary was located on the 2nd floor, but lacked records of patient stays or treatments. A smaller annex, labeled in maps as the transition quarters, was noted in only 2 floor plans before being excluded entirely in later diagrams. This structure, positioned behind the laundry building, was described as temporary but remained in place for at least 7 years. Maintenance of the property was managed through third-party contractors hired by the parish board. Among the few preserved invoices is a receipt dated October 1860, referencing repairs to a northern partition not marked on official plans. The contractor, operating under the name G. Lenton, submitted a hand-drawn schematic showing a fenced enclosure adjacent to the storage cellar. No permits or subsequent work orders for that area have been found. Lenton's business dissolved shortly after the war, and no follow-up correspondence is recorded. In late 1861, a local printer named Jonathan Vey approached the orphanage leadership with an offer to produce commemorative booklets detailing the history and mission of St. Athanasia. He was granted one on-site interview with the acting assistant director, but was denied access to the grounds. His published pamphlet, now archived at the Savannah Heritage Foundation, contains no direct quotations from staff or children. Instead, it compiles indirect commentary from benefactors and excerpts from diocesan circulars. Notably, the section on child placement ends mid-sentence and is followed by blank space before the next heading. City census figures for the period include general counts of dependent minors, yet cross-referencing these with orphanage admission logs reveals inconsistencies. For example, the 1860 census lists 89 minors under ecclesiastical custody in Chatham County. St. Athanasia's own ledger for that year records only 61 residents. No explanation is provided for the gap. Other institutions within the county submitted accurate breakdowns by name, making St. Athanasia the only entity to report aggregated figures without identifiers. A former staff member, Sister Aldine, was interviewed in 1878 for an unrelated diocesan publication. In her personal notes, preserved in an estate collection, she described the bookkeeping practices at St. Athanasia as repetitive, abbreviated, and discontinuous. She mentioned that some files were annotated with colored marks rather than entries, a method that was later abandoned by her successors. When asked about the missing resident records, she stated that numerical gaps were treated as procedural shifts rather than omissions. Her remarks were not included in the final publication and were archived only after her death. Efforts to verify apprenticeship outcomes for children assigned between 1859 and 1862 have yielded limited results. While several merchants listed on diocesan placement forms operated active businesses at the time, none maintained independent employment logs. A handful of worksite registries list juvenile assistants but omit full names. Some of the employers cited in St. Athanasia's ledgers cannot be confirmed as active during the placement period. Others, such as a shipping agent named H. Roden, appear in records only once and are not associated with any other parish institutions. The 1863 Diocesan Annual Review mentions St. Athanasia only briefly, noting its compliance with logistical expectations and standard turnover. The term standard turnover appears multiple times in the document, but is never defined. Financial summaries show no irregularities. However, personnel rosters list several positions as vacant without detailing transitions. The position of resident liaison, responsible for monitoring external placements, was left unfilled for 16 months. During this time, oversight of departures and arrivals was assigned to administrative aides whose names do not appear on any payroll or housing register. A private correspondence from a board member dated March 1864 discusses a growing lack of retention data from parish youth homes. While not naming St. Athanasia directly, The letter mentions an instance in which a group transfer was conducted without municipal notification. The letter expresses concern about diocesan liability, but recommends discretion. It was filed under administrative notes and carries a redacted signature. A penciled margin note suggests the author later recanted the concern, though no formal retraction appears in follow-up documents. Among the lesser-studied materials in the diocesan vault is a collection of transport logs marked internal only. These logs include schedules of carriage and rail transfers conducted between parish institutions. A recurring entry labeled Millen Southern 3C appears 12 times in a span of 17 months. Each entry includes a departure date from the Millen Street property, but lacks a destination. No recipient institution is listed. All entries are signed with the initials RK, which do not correspond to any known staff at St. Atalasia during the period. The southern rail depot closest to the orphanage handled both cargo and passenger routes. Official manifests from 1860 to 1863 are fragmentary, but select ledgers show bookings under the name of a lay brother affiliated with the church's logistics bureau. These bookings list bundled provisions and group travel assignments, a term typically used for youth delegations or choir tours. No church event or festival aligns with the dates in question. Other institutions did not report outbound travel during those periods, and no diocesan calendar entries suggest regional coordination. An incident report from the neighboring Holy Thorn School mentions a nighttime interruption in September 1861. A delivery wagon bearing ecclesiastical markings was mistakenly directed to the wrong property and remained for nearly 2 hours. The driver was unable to explain the confusion and was eventually redirected by a groundskeeper. The report notes that the wagon carried no furniture or supplies and had a covered rear section. The account, while peripheral, is one of the few third-party descriptions involving nighttime transport linked to the parish. No formal investigation was initiated during the operational years of St. Atalasia. Institutional accountability protocols were minimal and primarily financial. When the orphanage transitioned into a seminary annex in 1889, a final audit was performed, concluding that no critical discrepancies existed. This assessment focused on maintenance costs, land value, and remaining inventory. It did not evaluate historical records or resident files. Surviving documents from the audit contain lists of furniture, devotional items, and repair materials. No mention of personnel, children, or past placements appears in the inventory. In 1890, a civic petition was submitted by a small group of local historians requesting access to archival materials from defunct church institutions, including St. Atalasia. The petition was reviewed but ultimately declined by diocesan legal counsel. A brief response cited non-public classification of institutional documents and declined further comment. The petition and reply are stored in the city's historical correspondence file but have not been referenced in subsequent civic or ecclesiastical publications. The original site of St. Atalasia is now part of a commercial district. The buildings were demolished in the early 1900s. No commemorative plaque or historical marker identifies the location. A modest bronze sign on an adjacent wall notes the general presence of 19th-century religious structures, but omits specific names. In city planning documents, the area is designated only as former ecclesiastical zone. Construction permits from the era make no reference to the former orphanage, and no archaeological review was performed prior to redevelopment. By early 1860, clerical correspondence between parish directors and diocesan headquarters included a growing number of requests for clarification on transfer protocols. While these inquiries came from multiple youth homes across Georgia, several were directed specifically at the Millen Street property. One letter, authored by Father Elias Muntz of the Broadview home, questioned the absence of backdated placement confirmations. His request for the names and destinations of 5 minors previously assigned from St. Atalasia received no recorded reply. A marginal note from a diocesan clerk reads, "Inquiry acknowledged, awaiting consolidation notice." No diocesan-wide consolidation occurred during that year. Despite this, 3 other institutions recorded file changes aligning with St. Atalasia's undocumented placements. The gaps did not raise immediate alarm. Institutional policies at the time permitted private arrangements, and there was no formal requirement to report transfers across counties unless they involved a change in custodial funding. As St. Atalasia operated entirely through independent benefactions, it remained exempt from most clerical oversight. A rarely cited report from the Central Bureau of Diocesan Statistics includes a mention of intermittent shortfalls in sequential child numbers between 1859 and 1862. The report includes a chart displaying abrupt discontinuities in resident tallies, marked as anomalies but not corrected. The authors reference localized accounting practices and suggest that institutions with prolonged numbering gaps submit supplementary clarification. No such clarification was submitted from St. Atalasia. The orphanage continued to submit only aggregate figures in subsequent annual reports. A brief account in the September 1860 issue of the Savannah Parish Bulletin references an unusual revision to the Millen Street roster. It notes that 13 names previously listed in the March quarter had been omitted in the new ledger. A follow-up article in October attributes the change to clerical streamlining. The editor included a line stating that all inquiries regarding past residents would need to be directed through the bishop's office. No further public updates appeared. In the Internal Registry of Ecclesiastical Vehicle Assignments, compiled quarterly by the Diocesan Facilities Office, the number of scheduled late-night deliveries from the Millen Street property increased during this same period. Most were recorded under the code GL42, used for bulk material shipments. While this code typically referenced food or supply transfers, one entry labeled Child Transport was handwritten into the April 1861 manifest. It was the only use of that term across all recorded years. A second note next to it read, "No confirmation required. Special authorization logged." An assistant quartermaster attached to the diocesan depot later recorded a discrepancy involving an unscheduled return of an empty wagon on May 17, 1861. The wagon had departed 3 hours earlier with an assigned delivery, but arrived back without its original driver. Instead, a junior seminarian was listed as the replacement. The explanation provided at the time was that the driver had fallen ill during transit and was escorted to a nearby parish clinic. No admission or treatment logs from the clinic contain a record of this event. Among surviving communications from Sister Pelagia, one note stands out for its indirect phrasing. Dated November 1861, it is addressed to a contact at a neighboring order and includes a sentence referring to unexpected turnover now becoming part of seasonal operations. The phrase does not appear in any formal directive and is otherwise undocumented in institutional language. While vague, the wording suggests that shifts in residency were being normalized to avoid external scrutiny. No follow-up clarification is known to exist. A diocesan administrative circular issued in January 1862 attempted to standardize placement forms across all youth facilities. The new form included designated fields for destination parish, employer name, and travel method. St. Atalasia submitted only 2 such forms during the next 12 months. The rest of its transfers were documented with the older one-line entries, citing only dates and initials. A review by diocesan clerks in mid-1862 noted non-compliance, but did not initiate enforcement. A note appended to the review stated, "Established institutions presumed in alignment." One of the more detailed anomalies appears in the 1862 General Roster Audit. A clerk named Wilbur Denon annotated the Millen Street entry with the comment, "Sequential inconsistency persists across 3 quarters." He underlined the entry total, then added a question mark beside the column for confirmed placements. In a separate memo to his supervisor, he listed 12 identification numbers that appeared in January, but were gone by September, with no forwarding documentation. His memo is preserved, but the supervisor's response is not. The Diocesan Council meeting from July 1862 included a session focused on procedural irregularities across religious schools and homes. The minutes reference a pattern of non-standard exits, but avoid specific naming. A recorded statement by a council member remarked that Some institutions have streamlined records at the expense of transparency. No further debate on the subject is documented. When the topic of Millen Street's reporting was raised, the presiding bishop deferred to delegated oversight. One of the last surviving handwritten staff schedules from the orphanage includes annotations beside 3 night watch entries. The initials marked are unfamiliar and do not match any recorded staff names during that period. A diagonal strike across 2 rows suggests correction or removal. The date aligns with a previously noted transport log coded GL42. The implications of these entries were not evaluated until a later independent cataloging project attempted to cross-reference night shifts with transfer activity. That project remains incomplete due to missing personnel files. The archive of Bishop Remfrey, who oversaw diocesan operations during this period, includes a locked ledger referred to in subsequent inventories but now missing. It was labeled Orphanage Administration, Savannah. The index page remains in the archive, showing topics such as quarterly placements, emergency reassignments, and external correspondence clearance. An internal note from a later archivist marks the ledger as involuntarily removed during a 1914 document reorganization. No further record of its contents has been located. A merchant shipping manifest from the port of Savannah lists one entry of indirect relevance. Dated September 3, 1862, it references an outgoing shipment marked Private Clergy Freight, associated with the Millen route. The manifest indicates cargo under seal with no itemization. While clergy occasionally moved supplies through port facilities, the size and timing of the entry raised interest among a few civic researchers. The shipping firm dissolved in 1870, and no internal logs have been recovered. A notation in the 1863 diocesan personnel reassignment file includes a brief statement on St. Attalasia's administrative handover following the reassignment of Father Crail. It mentions a records integrity review and the arrival of a new documentation system. The review produced no formal findings. Internal notes reference a decision not to reconcile past files. This suggests an institutional choice to proceed without backward validation, a common practice when new directors assumed responsibility without direct continuity. At no point during this 3-year span did external civic agencies raise formal concerns about the orphanage. The absence of regulation, combined with the insular nature of diocesan administration, created a closed loop of accountability. Requests for verification were typically met with procedural delays or redirection to other departments. In rare cases where clergy were directly questioned, the response emphasized confidentiality and the safeguarding of ecclesiastical independence. In early 1863, a request from the Savannah Registry Office to obtain quarterly tallies from youth institutions was distributed across the county. The stated goal was to standardize civil records in anticipation of a statewide census update. Most institutions complied by submitting updated resident counts with supporting lists. St. Attalasia responded 3 weeks after the deadline with a single-page letter noting, "Figures consistent with prior diocesan submissions. No changes to report." This statement contradicted the observable reduction in reported numbers from previous quarters, but no challenge was issued. The Registry Office accepted the submission without further clarification. One of the few public figures to inquire about the orphanage during this time was Alderman Harlan Portier, who served on the Municipal Development Board. His notes, preserved in a local estate collection, indicate that he attempted to visit the property in May 1863 after receiving a letter from a merchant concerned about missing apprentice documentation. Portier's account describes his arrival at the gate, where he was turned away by a staff member who identified herself only as assistant to the clerical house. He recorded that no name or official title was offered and that no explanation for the denied access was given. An unusual procurement request submitted by the orphanage in June 1863 specified 12 crates of wax-sealed containers, catalogued under the designation non-perishables for temporary internal storage. The items were purchased through a supplier usually reserved for convents and infirmaries. The delivery address listed a secondary entrance to the grounds, previously designated for laundry collection. No record exists detailing what became of the shipment. Later inquiries into supply chain consistency by the Diocesan Inventory Committee did not reference the order. Between August and October 1863, 3 deliveries were logged at the Millen Street site without listed origin or invoice. These entries appear only in a clerical margin notebook labeled External Correspondence Traffic, maintained by a junior assistant to the Diocesan Shipping Office. The entries include the initials HP, possibly referring to the acting matron at the time, Sister Henriette Pellon. Each log entry is marked with the notation, "Processing complete, no return." The meaning of this phrase remains ambiguous, and no follow-up notes accompany the entries. Among the minor correspondence in diocesan storage is a brief letter from a local teacher dated November 1863. The teacher had been contracted to assist with literacy exercises at multiple institutions and reported a cancelled session at St. Atalasia. In her note, she wrote, "Upon arrival, found fewer students than recorded. Was informed of a reallocation, but no official update provided." Her report was appended to a routine expense claim and not addressed further. The entry remains in the accounting ledger without annotation. That winter, the orphanage chapel underwent minor restoration work. The contractor responsible, Mason Geary, included a line item for replastering of western retaining wall due to internal separation. This is the only known reference to structural reinforcement in that section of the property. Diocesan payment records confirm the work was approved and reimbursed, but architectural drawings of the time do not show any revision or damage to the western wall. Geary's original invoice includes a sketch of the repair zone which matches no known internal room layout. The transition roster of December 1863, which was intended to summarize all placements from the calendar year, lists only 8 names from St. Atalasia. This number represented a significant reduction from previous years. No explanation for the lower figure was provided in the summary. When compared with early year ledgers and estimated resident totals, the reported placements suggest a discrepancy of at least 17 individuals unaccounted for in written form. This variation was neither flagged nor addressed by diocesan administrators. In January 1864, a memorandum circulated within the Diocesan Administrative Council referenced pending concerns over procedural abstraction in residency transfer documentation. Though generalized, the memo appears to respond to multiple institutions failing to maintain consistent naming records. Attached to the memo was a revised sample form encouraging the use of full identification data rather than numerical designations. St. Atalasia continued to submit abbreviated entries for the remainder of the year. The 1864 diocesan budget proposal included a line item for Internal Record Reconstruction, Savannah Sector. A margin note specifies this fund was assigned to Sister Henriette for reformatting of legacy placement data. No outcome from this initiative is recorded. Surviving accounting summaries confirm the funds were disbursed and spent within 3 months, yet there are no replacement documents or archival transfers indicating that older files were updated, recopied, or preserved. A seldom cited entry in the private diary of diocesan archivist Julian Cardell, dated April 1864, recounts a brief inspection tour of parish institutions in coastal counties. In his entry, he mentions visiting St. Atalasia under the direction of his superior and notes a lack of record clarity. He writes, "Most documentation appears rewritten or transcribed recently, some folders mislabeled or bearing duplicate numbers. No older entries accessible." Cardell's entry did not trigger any official action, and his diary remained unpublished until 1932. One of the final references to numerical assignment irregularities appears in an internal diocesan-style manual issued in July 1864. The manual states that numerical identifiers are discouraged unless linked to supporting personal data. It recommends institutions convert existing number-based files to include name fields. While multiple facilities followed these guidelines, St. Atalasia submitted no conversion documents. By the end of the year, its ledgers still listed transitions under numbers only, several of which skip or repeat sequences without explanation. In late 1864, a transfer directive from the Diocesan Central Bureau reassigned 4 clergy members to review regional institutional compliance. While intended as a routine rotation, internal correspondence reveals that one member expressed concern about inconsistent reporting from Savannah-based entities. A letter addressed to the bishop from this clergyman notes, several transfers lack destination coordinates or employment verification. Cannot determine if outcome aligns with policy. The bishop's reply, preserved in draft form, acknowledged the observation but cited situational limitations due to regional constraints. By early 1865, efforts to standardize record-keeping across the diocese intensified. Institutions were ordered to submit retention audits, listing every individual still in residence from prior years. St. Atalasia's audit listed only those present at the time of submission. No retroactive accounting was attempted. The final column, labeled "Confirmed Carryover from Previous Year," was left blank. In a summary prepared by the Diocesan Review Board, St. Atalasia was categorized as active but unresolved regarding historical consolidation. In the subsequent years, no formal inquest was initiated, and no cross-referencing was performed to determine where or when the missing entries may have originated or concluded. When diocesan record-keeping was digitized in the 20th century, many of the original St. Atalasia files were excluded due to gaps, omissions, or missing verification data. As a result, no complete longitudinal profile of the institution's residents exists. The period from 1859 to 1862 remains the most heavily redacted segment. The first structured attempt to reassess the institutional practices of St. Atalasia came in 1871, 6 years after its most ambiguous record gaps. It did not originate from within the diocese, but from an external civic inventory project initiated by the Savannah Municipal Commission. The project, led by Clerk Assessor Gibbons Leahy, aimed to reconcile land use data with active charters and historical usage. While reviewing old property rolls, Leahy noted a misalignment in the declared occupancy statistics for the Millen Street parcel between 1859 and 1863. His notations flagged a sudden and unexplained drop in total residents, followed by the absence of any documentation of return or reassignment. Leigh submitted a query to the diocesan administrator requesting archived lists of residential population data for the 4-year period. The official reply acknowledged receipt but stated that resident tallies during that window are aggregated and unreconstructible due to procedural consolidation and file damage. This language did not match the style used in other institutional replies, which typically provided estimated figures or explanations involving wartime disruptions. Leahy included a copy of the response in his final report to the Commission, citing the case as non-verifiable data incomplete. That same year, a municipal archivist named Imelda Turch discovered an uncategorized stack of filing slips mislabeled as maintenance logs. On inspection, the documents appeared to be internal orphanage service requests written between 1860 and 1862. Among them were several referencing the rear transition wing, a term not seen in official architectural plans submitted to city clerks. The slips included brief remarks such as door locking mechanism failing again, storage crates marked out of sequence, and night inventory requires second confirmation. All were signed with initials that could not be matched to any known staff members. When Turch brought the materials to the attention of the City Records Office, she was instructed to catalogue them under miscellaneous clerical. Her notes, later appended to the archive file, suggest she believed the slips were part of a temporary ledger system used during unrecorded occupancy shifts. She noted that several of the referenced supplies, ink, ledger binding, and tin tagging implements, were normally requisitioned during resident transitions or reassignments. The lack of corresponding ledger entries from the orphanage itself led her to suspect that an undocumented tracking method had been employed during those specific years. Separately, a volunteer historian named Colin Barvey began compiling oral histories in Savannah's southern wards during the 1870s. His project, initially focused on wartime industrial shifts, included interviews with laborers who had once staffed church properties. Among those interviewed was a grounds laborer named Miles Jenk, who claimed to have worked at the Millen Street property during 1861. In Bav's notes, Jenk stated that he was assigned to haul soil to the northwest edge of the property for a 6-week period and was instructed not to enter the structure adjacent to the laundry. He referred to it only as the small storehouse with nailed panes. Jenk did not allege misconduct, but remarked that people there didn't speak much and gave no reason for night shifts. Bave attempted to follow up with the diocese for clarification on the outbuilding's use, but no records acknowledged its construction or removal. When Bave later requested access to internal work logs, his petition was declined by a legal representative acting on behalf of diocesan property management. The official response cited historical irrelevance to current holdings and declined further communication. In 1875, a National Religious Accountability Board distributed a questionnaire to all ecclesiastical institutions handling dependent care. The goal was to compile best practices and identify procedural lapses. While many responses were formal and unremarkable, the reply from the Savannah Diocese was shorter than average and omitted multiple required fields. The section labeled Past Auditing Concerns was left blank. The section on turnover verification simply stated, Internal validation performed per local discretion. The board marked the response as insufficient, but did not pursue further review. That same year, an internal training memo circulated within the diocesan office included a directive on historical file requests. It instructed staff that any archival inquiry older than 12 years should be logged, but not fulfilled without senior authorization. A separate paragraph outlined that former residents requesting past placement details should be referred to the communications liaison for appropriate redirection. While not referencing any specific location, the memo's language indicates an institutional awareness of archival sensitivity, particularly regarding orphanage files. In 1877, an unexpected point of contact emerged through the estate records of a merchant named Carsten Hemlin. Among Hemlin's papers was a brief contract listing a payment for custodial relocation services tied to an unnamed parish institution. The payment, dated July 1861, was directed to an entity registered only as RH Transit and listed an enclosed wagon and 3 uniformed staff. While no direct reference to St. Atalasia exists in the contract, the timing and description of the service align with the operational window in question. No other diocesan institution matches the location described in the invoice notes. A follow-up investigation by a regional heritage committee cross-checked local transport records and found no business licensed under the name RH Transit. The closest match was a temporary goods handler operated briefly out of a warehouse 2 blocks from Millen Street. That operation ceased in 1862 and its business filings were incomplete. Hemlin's estate executor included the invoice in probate filings, but its significance was not commented on in the final inventory. In 1879, diocesan archivist Julian Cardell, now a senior curator, initiated an internal file audit focused on institutions with unresolved record gaps. A draft list marked Sensitive Inquiry, Do Not Circulate, included a header entry for St. Atalasia Parish Home, 1859-1862 record stratum. Cardell's annotations show uncertainty about how to proceed, with notations such as files unrecoverable, duplicate numeric tags, and internal consensus unformed. He ultimately marked the entry as administrative closure advised, indicating no formal review would be attempted. Cardell's decision appeared to stem from a broader shift in diocesan policy that deprioritized investigations into historical file inconsistencies. By this time, many of the institutions with similar archival gaps had either closed or merged with newer diocesan facilities. Standard practice was to preserve only summary reports from defunct institutions. As St. Atalasia was repurposed rather than dissolved, its legacy files were stored in a secondary vault, which by 1880 was largely inaccessible without special permission. An unsigned internal letter discovered among loose diocesan correspondence in 1881 refers obliquely to residual concerns regarding dormitory file reconciliations. The letter includes a reference to the repeated deletion of non-conforming entries during administrative transitions. a phrase which suggests that files had been altered or removed during leadership changes. The letter was filed without accompanying documents or explanations, and no action followed. The final civic reference to the orphanage appeared in an 1884 property easement survey. The mapmaker annotated the rear quadrant of the original lot with the phrase, "Former Restricted Access Unit." No other map from that period uses similar language. The phrase was not standard for ecclesiastical properties and appears only in this single instance. Later revisions to city maps remove the label and do not mark the zone as distinct. Chapter 3, Part 1 completed. In 1885, a private index compiled by the Bureau of Parish Infrastructure listed defunct ecclesiastical properties across coastal Georgia. St. Atalasia was marked as functionally retired reassigned structure, with no annotation regarding prior use or special conditions. Adjacent facilities such as convents and small chapels were described in greater detail, including reference to founding clergy, dates of major repairs, and service affiliations. The orphanage's omission of such details was not explained in the notes accompanying the index. Researchers reviewing the list in later years noted that St. Atalasia was the only youth facility designated without a historical function summary. That same year, an inquiry from the Bureau of Public Welfare asked diocesan offices to identify any former dependent youth who might qualify for adult apprenticeship extensions under a newly approved economic aid provision. The response from Savannah's Ecclesiastical Administrative Unit stated that no direct documentation exists for carryover eligible individuals from the parish youth home between 1859 and 1862. The Bureau marked the case as unresolved and filed it under partial compliance. Institutions in adjacent counties submitted between 4 and 12 qualifying names each. As part of an unrelated property reassessment in 1886, surveyor Thomas E. Kells was hired by the city to conduct visual documentation of former church-owned parcels. His records for the Millen Street property describe an unusually uniform topography behind the main structure, with flattened terrain inconsistent with typical building foundation patterns. Kells noted the presence of a low-elevation depression near the rear corner, filled in with a distinct mix of compacted soil and masonry fragments. His log includes a sketch and the phrase, "not indicative of standard drainage correction." Kells's notes were submitted with the final city report, but not flagged for further examination. In reviewing parish logistical expenditures from the late 1850s and early 1860s, a pattern emerged in the frequency of sealed supply orders without itemized content. These orders, placed under private contracting codes, became more common during the years of interest. The original procurement files include forms signed only with initials or monastic titles, rather than formal names. Most include brief labels such as "contents secured under internal directive" or "packed for enclosed routing." No mention of delivery destination appears in diocesan summaries. By 1887, Savannah's newly formed Historical Institutions Committee began conducting interviews with retired clergy as part of an archival restoration initiative. Among the collected testimonies was that of Sister Felmina, who had served briefly at the Millen Street Orphanage in 1862. Her account, stored in shorthand and later transcribed, includes a comment that certain numbers were removed from ledgers entirely, not merely archived. She referred to the practice as cleansing the register, though she did not indicate who issued the instruction. Her testimony ends with the statement, "Some shifts were not discussed, only implemented." No corroborating documents link her directly to the administration during that period. In the spring of 1888, a correspondence from Diocesan Legal Counsel referenced legacy index volumes requiring revised access control. One of the named collections included former youth home placement logs. The letter recommends that request procedures be updated to route inquiries through a new permissions committee. A draft policy was attached, proposing that any case-specific historical reference beyond current operational alignment be assessed for public benefit before disclosure. The policy was never formally adopted, but remained in advisory rotation for over a decade. That same year, The Diocesan Planning Committee received a request to include a summary of all former childcare institutions in a centennial commemorative bulletin. St. Atalasia was listed only by name and founding date. No mention of its operational years or functions appeared in the publication. All other institutions received full entries including founding mission, operational highlights, and transfer of use. When contacted by contributors regarding the omission, the committee responded that historical material for that entry is incomplete and not suitable for inclusion. In 1889, when the structure was officially reassigned as a seminary annex, the final audit of the property was conducted by 2 administrators and 1 third-party observer. The report makes no mention of legacy records. It lists only fixed assets and structural condition assessments. In a footnote labeled Archival Disposition, the report states, pre-1870 materials not reviewed as part of reassignment proceedings. No supplemental review was scheduled. Following the building's reassignment, an equipment inventory was submitted showing significant disposal of unused filing materials. The disposal list includes over 3 dozen storage containers marked Archival, Incomplete, and Contents Not Re-indexed. No retrieval effort is recorded before the items were cleared. The location and contents of these containers were not documented in any subsequent review. In 1890, the Savannah Historical Index published a revised map of religious and civic institutions active before 1870. The orphanage was depicted as a small block labeled Parish Youth Unit Closed. The legend for the map identified other institutions by type and operational dates. The Millen Street property was the only religious site listed without functional details. Annotations accompanying the map stated, "Information sparse, reconstructed from property rolls and general memory." Later that year, a civic proposal was submitted to place a commemorative marker on the site, acknowledging the structure's role in the history of youth education. The diocesan office responded that the location did not reflect the sustained mission profile consistent with commemorative designation. The proposal was not pursued further. Adjacent properties received markers over the following 2 years, all including dates and institutional purpose. In an informal 1891 assessment drafted by a former diocesan record technician, a summary of file losses and restricted segments noted that numerical designations from the 1859 to 1862 range do not correspond to standard closure procedures. The assessment included a side note that several records were rewritten during administrative gaps with no sourcing authority. This document, though unofficial, remains one of the few internal references acknowledging post hoc modification of youth residence documentation. A regional archivist reviewing institutional blueprints in 1892 noted that copies of the original Millen Street plans differed slightly from maintenance maps created after 1865. The main dormitory wings were consistent, but a shaded zone labeled Auxiliary Enclosure appears only on the earlier version. When asked about the discrepancy, the Diocesan Facilities Office stated that all annex structures were temporary and not retained in long-term planning layouts. No construction or removal permits exist for the enclosure. In 1894, an updated census of diocesan property usage listed the Millen Street Annex as active for clergy housing and instruction. The line item under prior institutional purpose was left blank. In a summary issued to the Regional Heritage Board, the diocesan liaison clarified that records relating to earlier usage had been archived under non-operational designation and are not publicly indexed. The phrase non-operational designation was used in 3 other instances across the document, all involving properties with record gaps or undocumented transitions. No conclusive inquiry into the orphanage's undocumented years was initiated in the 19th century. The structure was eventually demolished and replaced by private developments. No physical indicator or archival cross-reference remains on site. Files marked for reassessment were either discarded or subsumed into general diocesan holdings without attribution. By the close of the 19th century, the institutional memory of St. Atalasia had become increasingly fragmented. Despite its central location and decades of operation, Few references to its internal practices appeared in public accounts or religious publications. In regional compendiums of ecclesiastical service, the orphanage was categorized only as a former youth housing unit, its functions summarized with the phrase, "inactive prior to documentation reforms." This phrasing became standard across diocesan directories, repeated without elaboration. One of the last surviving mentions of St. Atalasia in administrative discourse came from an 1895 circular distributed by the bishoprics office. The document addressed the standardization of archival retrieval processes and included a list of institutions for which pre-transition material may be inaccessible. The Millen Street property was the first listed under this category. No further elaboration was provided. Clergy responsible for answering historical inquiries were instructed to reference only verified post-reassignment content. Where such records did not exist, the guidance advised using blank return forms. The adoption of the blank return protocol marked a shift in how incomplete institutional histories were handled. Rather than reconstruct or investigate gaps, the approach emphasized closure through omission. If a case lacked supporting documentation, it was to be excluded from historical outputs altogether. This decision was justified on the grounds of administrative efficiency and preservation of narrative continuity in public-facing materials. Internal notes from committee meetings indicate that contested records were placed into restricted storage without public indexing. In 1896, a proposal emerged within the Savannah Historical Registry to include an entry for St. Atalasia in the forthcoming city almanac. The suggestion was made by historian Romain Evers, who argued that omitting the orphanage would present an inaccurate image of civic development. He submitted a draft paragraph summarizing its founding and decades of operation. The review board initially accepted the submission, but removed it in the final edition. No explanation was recorded in meeting minutes, and Evers later remarked in correspondence that he had been told to focus on still visible histories. Privately, archivists attempting to catalogue youth service records from the 1850s and 1860s encountered repeated obstacles. Source documents from the period were either unindexed or marked deferred. When researchers attempted to cross-reference placement numbers with institutional files, the entries were either empty or redirected to holdings labeled as non-accessionable. Efforts to verify basic data, such as dates of entry, names, or placement summaries, proved unproductive for any individual linked to the missing numerical series between 1859 and 1862. The 1897 release of the Diocese of Savannah's annual report made no mention of former orphanages. The publication, which included dozens of pages on educational and clerical initiatives, described the city's history in broad terms without citing individual institutions. Though schools and convents received dedicated summaries, St. Atalasia was not included among the legacy programs. A private note in the printer's draft copy shows that a placeholder had been reserved for a paragraph under Historical Homes, but the text box was removed before typesetting. Elsewhere, independent historians continued to raise questions. A brief exchange between researchers at the Georgia Colonial Records Bureau shows multiple failed attempts to secure archival clearance for reviewing old ecclesiastical housing logs. One letter, dated September 1897, references a follow-up call to the diocesan office that yielded only a verbal statement. The documents are considered incomplete and not subject to verification. The Bureau subsequently labeled the orphanage as unrecoverable for historical purposes. By 1898, regional archivist Mara Edins initiated a re-evaluation of youth placement methodologies in the state's ecclesiastical homes. Her effort involved comparative analysis of retained files across 4 counties. All participating institutions submitted baseline data except the Millen Street site, whose materials had been listed as not available for sampling. Edins's report notes that this absence resulted in a break in longitudinal consistency, limiting her conclusions about broader institutional practices. One of the final physical documents linked to the orphanage was a partial staff attendance ledger, stored without identification in a general clerical folder. The document lists daily initials across several months in 1861, but offers no corresponding names. The ledger ends abruptly and the final page is missing. A side note added in pencil at a later date simply reads, "Incomplete, before transfer." The folder was not catalogued until 1902, when it was merged into a miscellaneous clerical batch without cross-indexing. During the final administrative review before the close of the century, a procedural document labeled Non-Priority Archives Disposition referenced a batch of sealed holdings containing pre-1870 residential files. Among the locations noted was the Millen Street facility. The recommendation was to retain all items in sealed form without public listing. A memo appended to the document stated, "Do not circulate internally. No retroactive reconciliation required." The decision was approved without amendment. By the end of 1899, no further diocesan memos, civic reviews, or institutional audits referred to St. Atalasia by name. Its presence in official discourse was functionally eliminated. While some physical remnants of the structure remained into the early 20th century, they were not marked, cited, or included in educational materials. The property was redeveloped without a formal preservation study. No interpretive signs, memorial plaques, or city-sponsored commemorations acknowledged the prior use of the land. Into the early 20th century, references to the Millen Street Orphanage dwindled until they appeared only in residual property charts or in marginal notations within seminary site plans. Where once had stood a multi-use facility with consistent clerical oversight, there remained only an unmarked square on revised district zoning sheets. Institutions that had previously bordered the property had long since changed form or ownership, and no official record acknowledged any previous function beyond its last known use as clergy housing. Former staff members, by that time elderly or deceased, left minimal personal documentation. Journals and letters preserved in private estates offered only fragmentary insights, often containing general recollections with no specific dates or identifiable locations. One such letter, written by a sister Angelique and stored in a family ledger book, referenced her time at the River Quarter home prior to reassignment, likely alluding to the orphanage. Her brief mention includes the sentence, "Records did not match the count and questions led to no answers." The letter was undated and unsigned, folded into unrelated financial papers. Local parishes that had once supplied staff or goods to St. Atalasia adjusted their internal histories accordingly. Anniversary bulletins commemorating long-standing missions omitted the orphanage, even where its presence had influenced early parish activity. In public displays of institutional heritage, banners, ledgers, or framed donor lists, the name of the orphanage was never printed. Where photos existed of the building, captions were limited to generic identifiers such as Parish Grounds 1860s. By 1905, city-led historical tours began to include stops at former religious sites. The Millen Street parcel was not included on any route, nor was it marked on promotional materials. Tour guides received scripts from civic historians that detailed church structures, charitable halls, and civic schools, but orphanages were largely excluded. This decision was explained in a city planning memo as an effort to emphasize structures with enduring visibility and community continuity. An exception occurred in 1912, when a privately printed booklet by researcher Byron Littleton included a chapter titled Unmarked Sites of Parish Labor. In it, Littleton referenced a youth home once operational near the 3rd Cross Street east of the river, with no remaining documentation of residence or discharge. He noted the building's footprint and provided a rough drawing, citing oral history and unarchived correspondences. His attempt to corroborate any names failed due to absence of records. The chapter was later excluded from the expanded 2nd edition, which focused on confirmed institutional histories only. The parcel itself, by 1920, was home to a modest row of residential units built on repurposed church property. No markers or foundation stones remained. Construction records from the period make no mention of prior demolition or site remediation. Workers interviewed during unrelated historical research in the 1930s noted nothing unusual about the location. When asked whether any elements of the previous building were preserved or referenced, respondents replied that no indication of prior structures had been provided. That same decade, a group of diocesan volunteers began assembling a comprehensive institutional map for internal clerical use. The goal was to plot the locations and operational years of every religious, educational and care facility under diocesan jurisdiction since 1800. When the Millen Street site was identified, the volunteers were instructed to classify it as undetermined operation. The final map included a numbered index with a blank entry under that address. The map itself was not distributed publicly and remains in private storage. During the 1940s, a limited effort to digitize early youth placement ledgers produced summaries of known institutions. The St. Atalasia entries were not scanned, having been categorized as archivally incomplete with no base frame. When the project concluded, only 11 of the original 72 facilities had full entries. Among the unscanned records, the Millen Street group was noted as lacking matching intake and exit data across any resident profile. No correction attempt was scheduled. As archival practices evolved in the 1950s, materials deemed sensitive or incomplete were placed under restricted access codes. This classification applied to ledgers containing unverified placements, transfers with missing documentation, and personnel files with unresolved annotations. All orphanage records falling under these categories were moved to off-site storage and labeled by decade only. A 1953 inventory list includes Youth Institutional Ledgers, 1860s, Millen Quadrant, partial files. Their contents were neither summarized nor updated thereafter. In later decades, academic historians pursuing research into antebellum and Reconstruction-era child welfare systems occasionally cited the absence of verifiable documentation from certain institutions. Footnotes referring to St. Atalasia described it as administratively opaque or archivally non-compliant. None of the studies was able to reconstruct a complete resident list, operational log, or placement record for any year in its final decade. No one affiliated with the original administration was documented as having offered a public account of operations. By the end of the 20th century, diocesan records displayed no references to the orphanage beyond general administrative outlines. The institution's name had disappeared from all published diocesan histories. No commemorative services, plaques or dedications acknowledged the property's former function. Local historical societies treated it as a minor footnote, if at all. Institutional silence, reinforced by procedural omissions, prevented sustained inquiry or public memory. Today, no physical trace remains of the building. The surrounding area contains no references to the former structure's location or role. Its records, once held in indexed binders and transfer slips, were removed from public circulation and boxed without categorization. Any attempt to verify the specifics of its resident history or internal operations encounters only aggregate totals, unnamed entries, or erased annotations. No civic register contains names of the 15 children unaccounted for between 1859 and 1862. No surviving photograph includes their presence. No burial, discharge, or apprenticeship document has been found that confirms their status. Their assigned numbers appear only briefly in ledgers, each followed by a blank space or unexplained strike-through. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way, we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering. This story is fictional. All names have been edited to protect the source.